Good morning. Thank you all for tuning in this morning. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Ms. Lee Wellington is the founding executive director of the Urban Manufacturing Alliance, a national nonprofit that builds robust, inclusive manufacturing sectors in more than 250 cities across the United States. Through a mix of collaborative research and ecosystem building, and under Lee's leadership, UMA has become nationally recognized for knowledge transfer across public agencies and community based organizations. She has led the UMA team in building national learning communities on a range of issues, including access to capital, community embedded workforce programming, and mission driven industrial real estate development. In 2018, Lee guided UMA's flagship research project, The State of Urban Manufacturing, a six-city study on small city manufacturing involving multiple Federal Reserve banks, research universities, and hundreds of local manufacturing practitioners. Lee is a frequent presenter on urban manufacturing at conferences nationally and internationally, including Berlin's Urban Tech Summit, the White House's National Week of Making, the International Business Innovation Association's Conference on Business Incubation, and the National League of Cities City Summit. Prior to UMA, Ms. Wellington worked in the public sector at the NYC's Mayor's Office of Industrial and Manufacturing Businesses and the New York City Council at nonprofit planning organizations, including the Pratt Center for Community Development and the Waterfront Alliance, and at legal services organizations, including the Urban Justice Center's Street Vendor Project and South Brooklyn Legal Services. Ms. Wellington holds a JD from Brooklyn Law School, an MS in City and Regional Planning from Pratt Institute, and a BS in Economics from the Stern School of Business at New York University. So that means you really need to ask her some questions. So please put questions in the chat. I would like to introduce to you none other than Miss Wellington.
Thank you. You had the full bio there.
Yes, enjoy.
Thank you so much, Latanya, for that introduction. But I also just want to say thank you for connecting with me personally. Before the conference, Latanya and I had an opportunity just to chat about her time at Coppin, my work at UMA, about motherhood. And it's really those personal connections that we make through these conferences that I think make a real impact in the way that we see the world and the way that we approach economic development. So thank you for that. I also want to thank Victoria, who has helped me gear up for this conference, so patiently teaching me how to use the platform that we're using today. There are so many people behind the scenes that make conferences like this possible. So I just want to acknowledge her time. Team's time. Eva has been so instrumental in helping me prepare today, as well as the people at home. I have a babysitter watching my newborn, my husband printing out my talk today. It really does take a village. Dr. Ron Williams asked me to speak at this session, and I was so very, very honored to be a part of this conference. It's what I live and think about each and every day. I also warned him that I'd be a little bit rusty. This is my first talk as I return back from maternity leave. So thank you all for your patience and bearing with me as I adjust to that ever delicate work-life balance. But one of the reasons I jumped at this is because this conference is so very urgent. And we all know that far too well. This conference is an urgent one because of the twin pandemics that we're wrestling with, COVID-19 and dismantling systemic racism. It's an urgent one because of the power structures at play, for far too long have suppressed people of color. And while a conference on inclusive economic development might seem somewhat attenuated from issues of public health and safety, I assure you that these issues are all bound up into one. Access to economic opportunity is very much a part of our collective health and well-being. So hopefully we're all feeling that urgency today as we dig into the material. What I'll be doing is showing manufacturing, I'm taking a very specific sectoral approach, can be used as a vehicle for eroding what are very dangerous power structures in our country, can be used as a vehicle for shared economic opportunity and wealth building. And what I hope coming out of this conference you'll be able to do is connect your own personal stories to the manufacturing sector. And I'll start by sharing one of my own and then some that I've encountered through my work day to day. And hopefully you'll start digging into your own personal past, your own professional past, and think about the various nexus points between manufacturing and yourself. So I'll start a little bit about my great-grandfather, Grandpa Louie. He worked on a factory floor during the day. He sprayed shipping insulation into ships. So the foam insulation he was spraying into ships out at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He did this during the week, and he was a building superintendent on the weekends when he wasn't on that factory floor. And there was quite a bit of stability in that job. It put a roof over my grandmother's head, and he was a new immigrant. He didn't speak the language. He didn't, it was a brand new country to him, but he was able to find his way to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and access this job. And that was something meaningful. There were also very significant downsides to this job. The work was very physically intense. It was dangerous. The environmental hazards tied to this job weren't well understood at the time, but now they're quite well known. And this story is a common one for people that were in commodity-based production. The job stabilized families, but they also had a dark side. They didn't always offer career ladders. They didn't offer opportunities to build wealth. And sometimes they were extremely dangerous and even deadly. And so with that past, I come to you now as the great-granddaughter of an immigrant factory worker with a very reconceived notion of manufacturing. I'm going to make the case today that manufacturing actually provides very safe and desirable career pathways, that manufacturing is a pathway for community development. And I'll take it one step further, that manufacturing is a vehicle to support racial equity and wealth building in our communities. And to take you on this journey, I'll share with you the work of the Urban Manufacturing Alliance. This is an organization I am so humbled to lead, a network of economic development practitioners spread all across the country that are thinking day in, day out about how they harness the power of manufacturing in their own communities to support vibrant, equitable neighborhoods. And I started this line of work, not at UMA, but this work around manufacturing policy about 15 years ago when I was working for the city of New York on land use policies that were designed to protect and stabilize industrial land. And at that time, we talked a lot about preserving working class jobs. We talked about family sustaining wages. What we weren't talking about was racial equity. We weren't talking about wealth building. We were talking about land use policies to retain industrial companies. That frame has shifted markedly. And today at UMA, what we're working on is building this new narrative, a narrative grounded in intentional access points, where manufacturing is connecting to communities of color, not just for those entry-level jobs, but to build wealth. And I should point out that I'm doing this work as a white woman. Hopefully you have your visuals on and we can see one another. I actually can't see you, which is such a strange sensation. And I miss the days of in-person conferences, but hopefully we'll come back to that soon. But I do this work as a white woman. And that means that I have to refine my approach and the most central element in my work is to listen and lift up, to be a student of those organizations that are advancing racial equity in their neighborhoods. And what I'm doing is making space for those organizations to showcase their work in their own voice. And so what I do is I really view this as an exercise in both ecosystem building, so connecting organizations to one another so they can do their work better, and authentic storytelling. So lifting up the voices of those that are doing the work and the communities that are actually benefiting from manufacturing. And internally within our organization, we've been giving a lot of thought to how do we mirror the values that we espouse externally. And so one of the things that we're now exploring is how to move from an organization with a single executive director to more of a worker self-directed model. Think like a worker cooperative, but in a nonprofit context. And we think that this will better exemplify the world that we're trying to really create and build through our manufacturing practitioner community. So that was a lot of context in the way that I approach this work in my family history. That's a little bit of storytelling for me. So now I'm going to share my screen. I've practiced this, so let's see how it goes. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to dig into a manufacturing journey with you all. So bear with me one second. Okay, here we are. So I talked a little bit about my grandpa Louis and the manufacturing that he was tapping into. We'll call it for shorthand legacy manufacturing. Legacy manufacturing were jobs that offered family-sustaining wages. The businesses tended to be larger and broadly accessible, and they had strong economic multipliers. And by that, I mean that the benefits of manufacturing were felt widely across local communities and really regions. But there was a combination of global forces, automation, environmental regulation, all of this coming together that led to a decline in some of these traditional manufacturers. The economies where those manufacturers left suffered. They felt deep holes from the exodus of these manufacturing firms. But tragically, it was those that were most vulnerable that suffered the most. And so that means communities of color in older industrial cities were hit especially hard. And the perception of manufacturing is still today tied up in what I'll call the 3Ds: a dying industry, dirty, and dangerous. But this is not an entirely gloomy story. Otherwise, our organization would not be here really celebrating manufacturing, because there were some manufacturers that survived and indeed thrived. These firms tended to be much smaller. And what they did was they offered dynamic positions with career ladders because they were steeped in other elements of the local economies and cities, like design, technology, and craft. And this created a real opportunity for emerging manufacturers because they could tap into the creative assets of those cities. And the most important asset being the people. And I'm talking about people as purchasers, so the end market for the manufacturing sector, people as talent, and the people behind those manufacturing companies, whether as owners or as the manufacturing workforce. And what I'm describing are some really significant changes to the way the sector operates. And I'll walk through that. The sector still offers some living wage jobs, right? An opportunity to work with your hands. It doesn't require a 4-year college degree, and it can benefit the community broadly. But the career ladders tied to the sector today, they offer generational wealth building opportunities. They offer an opportunity to advance equity and inclusion. But here's the catch. These jobs are not always easy to identify, and they require some very specialized technical skills. And so you have this complicated paradox where, on the one hand, this new modern manufacturing that we're seeing can provide this pathway to equity, but yet it's not accessible. And so that's really the problem. To access manufacturing jobs, to access the manufacturing ownership and entrepreneurship opportunities, people need the skills and training. They need to be able to unpack these hidden networks to break into the sector. They need a mix of capital and mentorship. And they need to believe that manufacturing has promise. And that means a new narrative and a reconceived perception of what manufacturing is today. And if we do nothing and we just let these emerging opportunities in manufacturing percolate through our economy, the manufacturing jobs and ownership will not be a place that's breeding equity. It will actually be deepening inequality. And that's what at UMA we seek to fix. And so luckily at the Urban Manufacturing Alliance, we get to see that the solutions are all around us. we can solve for a perception gap. We can solve for this capital problem. We can break apart these networks, dismantle these power structures, and connect people to the manufacturing sector. We can address these training needs. And we're seeing that these solutions are manifesting themselves in very place-based ways. And so what we do, again, at UMA is to connect the dots between something that may be happening in Baltimore and something that may be happening in Chicago, so that programs can replicate and programs can scale, and we can ultimately see manufacturing as an engine for equity and inclusion. So I'm going to take you on a journey through 3 different cities that we think are showcasing solutions to what an equitable manufacturing sector can look like. And these solutions are all around us. They're all over the country. These are just 3 examples. And as I walk through these 3 examples, I want you to take note of the interdisciplinary nature of these programs. When Ron opened up the conference, he mentioned that we'll be hearing from people across a variety of academic departments. Similarly, at UMA, we take a very, very broad perspective on what a manufacturing practitioner is. So these examples highlight community development financial institutions. They highlight faith leaders. They highlight workforce organizations. And in order to get this right, in order to truly make the manufacturing sector one that is equitable, we need to engage a broad array of service providers, and we had to really open up our minds to the fact that an arts organization, a banking institution, they all need to be at the table to make manufacturing what it needs to be. So starting with Pittsburgh, this is a community development financial institution called Bridgeway Capital, and they were launched in the early 90s. Address the holes in the economy that were left by the departing steel industry. And what they did, in addition to traditional lending, small business lending, nonprofit lending, was to launch something that they call the Creative Business Accelerator. And what they have done with this accelerator is really focus on craft-based businesses and provide a mix of mentorship, technical assistance, and capital where appropriate to those small businesses. And in doing this, they realized that the businesses that they were most readily connecting with them were white-owned businesses, and they needed to be intentional about connecting to business owners of color. And so they launched the Origins program, and this is specifically for businesses of color, and they're doing a bunch of targeted programming. One that I particularly like is a residency program to provide stable, affordable space for a cohort of makers of color. And this was a way of making sure that they were reaching the very business owners that they wanted to serve in the program. And one of the creative approaches that they took to making sure that they were opening up economic opportunity to these businesses was thinking about how to expand the end market for craft companies. And so they unlocked the power of real estate developers. There was real estate development proliferating all through Pittsburgh, and they said, why is it that when we put in a countertop that we're not sourcing from a local or regional? How do we connect the dots between this real estate developer and the lighting designers, the cabinet manufacturers, the tile makers? And that's precisely what they did. They worked with the companies so that they knew that they were ready to jump into a real estate setting where they were going to have to scale very quickly. And they worked with these purchasers to show that Pittsburgh was open for business and the manufacturing economy was there for them to tap into. And it's that sort of collision between sectors that we don't ordinarily think about, transformative for the manufacturing sector, and create real opportunities for wealth. So now we're going to hop over to Chicago, and we're going to talk a little bit about the training paradigm. Manufacturing Renaissance is one of our key partners, and they provide technical training, advanced manufacturing training for Black youth. And they're doing this in a way where they're not just thinking about the technical skills that are needed to enter a factory floor. They're thinking about the entrepreneurial skills, because they recognize that people in manufacturing are not necessarily just going to be part of the workforce. They may decide to own their own companies. And so they're providing that continuum of training and support. They also realized that it's a hard sell to make manufacturing look attractive to people that have a very different perception of it. And so they started a number of coalitions to help reimagine and reinvent the manufacturing sector for people that might not be touching manufacturing today. So one of my favorite examples here is their Ministers for Manufacturing Coalition, where they're educating faith leaders. And by that, they're taking faith leaders on factory tours. They're engaging them in meetings. They're sharing stories of successful youth coming out of their programs to those that are working in faith settings so that they can share that with their congregations and identify mentors within their congregations for those entering careers. And that to me is exactly what we need to be doing, because it's an intergenerational approach. It's not just focusing on the young people that might be entering the sector or the people that are looking to change careers into manufacturing. It's focusing on the whole family. They also engaged young manufacturers through a young manufacturing association so that instead of the economic development practitioner trying to convince somebody that they should take a leap of faith and get this credential in manufacturing, they're having young people talk to other young people. And that's the greatest endorsement. They're also working to engage the business community. And that is really critical when you're talking about training, because often we develop these training programs in a vacuum and we're not hearing specifically from businesses about the gaps that they're seeing when they hire a new employee. And so by creating a business roundtable, they're making sure that their community embedded workforce program is truly community embedded. And so through all of this, they're opening up new work opportunities, starting new businesses out of this training. And they've raised now $6 million for advanced manufacturing training, and their program continues to scale. And now we're going to talk about industrial land use, which is where my work emerged in this manufacturing space. And we're going to go back to my home city, New York, and talk a little bit about Evergreen, which is in the North Brooklyn section of New York City. These folks are not actually real estate developers. They're a nonprofit organization set up to provide business support services and direct technical assistance to manufacturers. And time again, they're in a very high cost environment. And they were finding that one of the challenges was accessing affordable and stable industrial space. And this space that folks can access is very much tied into trust and the belief that your landlord is going to keep you around in the building, that you have a relationship with that landlord. This is especially true when you talk to women and business owners of color who say, I don't feel comfortable putting my dollars into a building, whether they're a long-term tenant or they're thinking about purchasing a building, because there's not that trusting relationship there. And so what Evergreen set out to do was to become that trusted landlord. And they leveraged two city-based programs in order to make that a reality. One of the programs that they accessed is called the Urban Manufacturer Accelerator Fund. And what I like about this program is that it's transforming organizations that had no connection to the development side of the work into industrial developers. It's building capacity for those organizations so they can wear that development hat. And then the other program is the Industrial Development Fund. And this is to actually provide those dollars to help finance these affordable industrial real estate projects. And as a result of tapping into these two city-based programs, Evergreen is now providing stable, affordable space to industrial businesses in a way that's going to feel to create that level of trust and connectivity for businesses that may not take that leap of faith and step out in their own space. So what I've mapped out are a couple of solutions, and I could go on with many. And these solutions are making sure that manufacturing can be a strategy for equity and wealth building. However, these solutions are playing out hyper-locally and often in isolation. And we have this global challenge at our hands, where manufacturing, if left unchecked, will only be available to those that know how to access the jobs, access the capital, access these ownership opportunities. And that is really inequity. So how do we solve this problem at UMA? What we're doing at the Urban Manufacturing Alliance is solving for the communication gaps, because we believe that no city should be really approaching this work in a silo. And that the experimentation that we talked about in Pittsburgh and Chicago and New York, and you'll be hearing from so many folks like Andy Cook out of Baltimore, these experiments can be replicated and scaled. And so what we do at the Urban Manufacturing Alliance is connect the dots, both within and between cities. And the way to connect these dots, again, is through storytelling. And that's why, if there's anything I can get across in my time with you today, it's these stories. It's making sure that you get your own story out, you share your own experience. And our role is to elevate that and really help folks to reimagine the powerhouse that manufacturing can be. And I'll just end here with this slide deck by saying we have a number of publications that dig into many of the issues that you'll be wrestling with today, whether it's capital access. We are convening right now a network of community development financial institutions that are thinking, how do we direct loans to makers and manufacturers of color? How do we experiment with alternative sources of capital and create equity or equity-like products that work with the needs of manufacturers? So take a look at that Pathways program. We have a whole community of practice dedicated to equity, where we're thinking about how racial inclusion and manufacturing can be and should be talked about in the same breath. And we have a project that we're doing right now with the Century Foundation that we call Industry and Inclusion. And what that project is really focused on is bridging the gap between communities, educational institutions, and industries to create these community embedded workforce. So I encourage you all to dig into this. And even if you didn't think that you were connecting to this work through a sectoral lens, I do find that the work in this manufacturing space provides really important and transferable lessons for entrepreneurial activities and equitable economic development programming broadly. So with that, let me exit out of here and stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions I can take from all of you. Just making sure they're loading. Well, I do not see any questions at the moment, but I look forward to engaging in conversation throughout the conference and beyond. And please do check out our website. We take a very broad definition again of what it means to be a manufacturing practitioner. And so whether you're a student that's interested in small business development, an academic that's wrestling with issues of capital access or workforce development, somebody that's thinking about how to stabilize land use policy, please engage with our network and join us. Oh, and now all of the questions have loaded. Here we go. So one of the questions here is around apprenticeships. Do we see an evolution in the way we're thinking about apprenticeships? This is absolutely an area that's been evolving over time. One of the things that's been really exciting for us in the industry and inclusion work that we have been doing is thinking about pre-apprenticeship work. And so not waiting till folks get out of high school to create that connection to the manufacturing sector, but creating a lighter touch intro in a high school setting. And what's interesting about the programs that we've seen evolving in the high school setting is that you have really mission-aligned principals that are working with these workforce providers to create the flexibility in the high school setting so that students early in the day and tap into real life manufacturing experience, tap into those internships and get a credential right as they're graduating high school. There is certainly a lot of work that's happening in the community college space and in a university setting as well to expand manufacturing credentials. But we see a lot of excitement and energy playing out in this high school context. So happy to talk more about that offline, but I'd say that that is an emerging area. One question that came up is, how does one go about connecting to a manufacturer? This is a great question. And when I talk to local electeds, when I talk to folks that are thinking about how do I learn about the manufacturing sector, where is the first place to start? One of the things that I point to is the value of local branding organizations. And the beauty of the city of Baltimore is that you have one of these made in organizations in your city, made in Baltimore. And these are networks that are creating your makers and manufacturers, connecting them to one another, and helping to showcase the power of those makers to the outside world. And many cities do not have these, but they have chambers of commerce who are aware of your local manufacturing base, economic development agencies that are aware of the manufacturing base. Even the city planning departments that are tracking the industrial land may know some of the dominant manufacturers in that space. Your manufacturing extension partners, which is out of a federal program, the NIST MEP, there are MEP centers all over the country. They have a keen understanding of who the manufacturers are in your given place. But what's beautiful about the work that's happening with local made-ins is they're tapping into the very small scale maker capacity, the capacity that's often hidden beneath the surface that gets missed when you're digging into the manufacturing sector. And so I encourage you to, if you're based in Baltimore, to look to Made in Baltimore as a resource and to check out these local branding platforms as a vehicle for connecting to makers. The other thing that I find is that makers don't necessarily know to tell their story, right? They're focused on running their business, and community stakeholders don't know to necessarily reach out and learn about what modern manufacturing looks and feels like. And so these stories end up never getting transferred because the connections don't get made. And so no matter what the service provider you're reaching out to find that local manufacturer, maybe you're just picking up the phone when you notice that there's a manufacturer in your region. I find that there's a lot of excitement once you dig into getting to know one another and telling those stories, and that's really my call to action when I talk to stakeholders or business owners, is to share what manufacturing looks and feels like and what the needs are. Another question that has come out is around let me just see if I can distill this here. Collaboration with community in the small business life cycle. In order to reach businesses in a equitable way, you need to engage a broader base of community partners. One of the strategic alliances that the Urban Manufacturing Alliance formed early on was with the Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC for short. And when people think about LISC as a CDFI, they think about the instrumental role that they play in housing development. They think about the way that they build capacity for the nonprofits in their community. They don't often think about manufacturing. But in actuality, LISC has been such an important driver of support nationally, and really a model for other CDFIs, smaller CDFIs across the country to follow, because they've been able to make direct loans to affordable industrial space. They've been able to connect the dots between residents in communities and manufacturers in communities. And so again, really taking a wide look at who are the stakeholders that are making community a fairer and more just place, and bringing them into the manufacturing conversation is really quite critical. And so, I highlighted faith leaders as one example, but I could give the same talk and speak to you about art museums or commercial kitchen spaces or public markets, and the message would be the same. This is how you reach a broader array of small businesses and provide a continuum of support that's going to make an impact. Well, I thank you all for your time again. It is a pleasure to connect with you, and I look forward to hearing the sessions to come.